And we are live. It's another great day in Cribl TV. It's Ed Bailey and Jackie McGuire, the usual suspects. We are here to share, to talk, hopefully to educate, and maybe have a little bit of fun. Jackie, how are you doing today?
I'm great. It's Friday. It's sunny in Arizona after several days of torrential downpour. So it could be worse. Life could be worse.
There you go. It is definitely Friday. The weather in Atlanta is wet. It's weird. I mean, last week it was in the teens. This week it's 75 degrees right now. It's kind of insane. I would like the sun to come out. My fingers are crossed.
Yeah, I've been waiting to start construction on my backyard for the rain to stop. So I'm excited that it finally seems to be passing here.
There you go. I mean, I've always heard it never rains in Southern California, and I mean, you live out in the desert, so you're getting a lot of rain too. Is that unusual?
No, it's not. So it rains quite a bit here. Actually, we have monsoon that goes from like July to October, so it'll just torrentially downpour for like 15 to 45 minutes in the afternoon, and then it turns into it's very similar to the Bay Area in the winter. In Tucson, it rains, every week or two. And it gets really green, which is nice. Like all the hills get all green and vibrant.
Yep, I bet the wildflowers in the spring are pretty nice.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it here. I mean, I feel like it's a really well kept secret because Tucson doesn't get as hot as Phoenix does and it's not as big. And so I try to not tell people about it because we keep it that way.
There we go. Send all those housing developments to Tucson instead of Phoenix.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Jackie, tell me what are we going to talk about today?
All right. So we figured we would dive into some of our 2024 trends and predictions. So towards the end of last year, our team worked on this white paper that's linked here. It's got it here in the banner. And really just kind of looking at what we saw happening over the course of 2023 and what we foresee happening over the course of this year. We recapped what we had predicted the previous year. We went through a similar exercise and then made some predictions for this year. So one of the big ones that had already started to happen. So, and it's most people don't realize that when you're going to write something for the end of the year, you started in like July or August, right? So we started writing these predictions and we wrote them, and then a bunch of them came true to the extent that we actually had to change them because we're like, well, it's just going to look like we're stating the obvious now. But consolidation. So consolidation was a huge thing. Anytime you see explosive growth the way we have in the security and IT markets over the last, feels like it's been since venture capital started in the 90s, but there's been this growth, and it tends to go in these cycles of expansion and contraction, and you find small scrappy companies work on things that end up being features of larger products, and we had started to hear with some of the large high-profile acquisitions that happened throughout the end of the year last year, we were hearing from customers some kind of discontent, if you will, and some worry over what that was going to mean for their business, for their security. So figured we would talk about that today, both what you should think about should you run into unexpected consolidation amongst your vendors, and also how to kind of position yourself to withstand that and have the most control over your data and your architecture.
Yeah, it's a great topic. I think it's not something companies think enough about in terms of planning, setting expectations, because it's going to happen. And so, if a key provider is acquired, or what are you going to do? What's the disruption going to look like? I've seen this over and over again myself, and so I think it's great to talk about some of the second and third order effects, and also how to prepare yourself to manage those shocks.
Yeah, and I think we've already heard there. Just to kind of recap some of the bigger acquisitions we saw last year. Obviously, one of the ones that comes to top of mind is Cisco's acquisition of Splunk for $28 billion. We also had Silver, so we also had a lot of private equity. That was the other thing that we started to see quite a bit towards the end of the year last year was some companies being taken private and being acquired by private equity. Silver Lake's acquisition of Qualtrics is a really good example of that. Yep. We had Databricks acquire Mosaic. That was a pretty big pickup at $1.3 billion. Talus acquired Imperva for $3.6 billion. So there lots of consolidation towards the end of the year, and then things seem to have just picked up even more at the beginning of this year. So it's not something that's slowing down anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think especially is as with the weird economy, that smaller companies, startups, companies that haven't quite maybe achieved profitability, I think there's going to be a lot of consolidation there because they just run out of runway, and so larger companies are going to pick them up, and I wouldn't be surprised more often than not you have a very large company picks up a small company. It's just for the IP, and that's
Yeah.
it. And so if you're a
Yeah.
customer, you're in trouble.
Yeah. And especially with a lot of these companies are relatively young, right? I think in the in the corporate world in general, you wouldn't think of a company as being young if it's 10 years old, but for a software company that's really not, not not that mature. And so I think one of the interesting things is as the consolidation happens, I think about private equity and venture capital that that's really concerning because one of the things that I watched happen quite a bit when I worked in venture capital is you have companies that start with these like startup business models. Um, and not to say that you don't need kombucha on tap in all of your offices and like you shouldn't have free massages for all of your employees and things, but like startups aren't always built with the most lean and efficient business models, right? So a lot of times you've got a whole bunch of money in the bank, you're spending somebody else's money, and so we have a lot of companies that have built really powerful tools, but they built them with these business models that are probably have some room to tighten the belt a little bit. And so that I think alone is going to drive a pretty large wave of private equity acquisitions.
Right.
And if you're thinking about a vendor that was previously providing cushy benefits and had fun conferences and was throwing a whole bunch of things in for free every time you renewed your licenses because they were in that hyper growth mode,
Oh,
that's something that may be coming to an end. So
yeah.
that would be something I would be looking at pretty hard.
Yeah, I mean, that's classic. I mean, because a lot of the acquisitions that you mentioned, I mean, several of them are around Francisco Partners or picking that, like the Imperva acquisition went through them. I mean, they're
Mhm.
picking up a company, you lean it out and flip it and make $1 billion, and then you got New Relic, Sumo, and so it's. I think it's not going to slow down. If anything, it's going to, and especially with the environment where it's, for some companies it's just hard to find revenue.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as things
Mhm.
become, and it's interesting too. I think there's still some our boss and I were actually
Mhm.
arguing a couple days ago over whether we're going to have a soft landing this year, right? Because there seems to be a lot of pessimism in the market, and he's like, but the numbers just aren't bearing that, right? Like if you actually look at the numbers, like most of the numbers are up and to the right.
Right.
Earnings season was really good towards the end of this year. Um, so whether that's going to happen or not is still up for debate. And I think one of the interesting things that will start to happen is as technologies grow and as new technologies emerge, they often start out as free. So I think about AI a lot when I'm thinking about this, and that everybody right now is using free AI within their enterprise, right, and getting a lot of
Someone's paying for it.
value. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's like it's exceptionally computationally intensive. It costs quite a bit of money, those cloud bills don't pay themselves. And so as we start to think about, these companies becoming leaner, and if we do see a pullback in the economy, which I am on the bear side of that for the record, it is something that I think we're going to end up seeing some of these costs being passed on to customers. And I've been worried for a long time around AI that we have businesses that are building critical components of things like anomaly detection, security, IT, logging, and all of that around these free tools. And what's going to happen when all of a sudden those aren't free anymore because somebody needs to start paying the bills for them, or they
Yeah.
just stop working, which is
It,
a nightmare
it's
scenario.
remarkable how you have adults talking about free. It's like there's always a cost.
Yeah,
Someone's paying for it. There's always a cost, and you put yourself in a position where you've wrapped yourself up into something that's free and it's no longer free. You're now you're screwed. And
yeah,
so, I mean, it's definitely a thing. And I think you're right to bring up AI too, because I mean, you look at Mosaic. I mean, talk about a baller move. I think what 200 people selling themselves for 1.3 billion. I mean, that's
yeah.
just can't beat that.
That's why
Yeah.
house prices in Marin aren't going down anytime soon.
Oh yeah. Tell me about it. And but it's just smart. Companies are looking to position themselves, and especially you have a niche thing that requires a lot of talent, and a lot of
Yeah.
compute. I mean, it's a natural fit. So you're going to see, and I think also from a free cash flow perspective, you're looking at the market. that companies are going to use that money and they're going to make it acquisitions. But I think it's also really, you look at the economy, so much of it's psychological. The numbers may say one thing, but how people feel is what matters.
Yeah.
And and how people feel is oftentimes doesn't reflect reality.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most panic sells are not triggered by something that's reality. It's triggered by an overreaction to something. Uh, I do think one of the interesting things that's also become more prevalent is that it used to be that software companies were really valuable for the software that the code that they had written, the product that they had built. Now we're getting to a point that companies can be just as valuable for the data they possess and the data they process as they are for the actual software that's doing that processing. And so one of the things that I've been super leery about is the prospect of consolidation that's motivated by data collection.
Right.
So I wish people read the licensing agreements of the software that they use and their data collection policies, but oftentimes they don't. And usually you're not just signing away the right for the company to collect your data, but also for them to then sell it and sometimes increasingly now to monetize it. And so
Right.
it can be a huge uh, consideration, especially if you're a highly regulated business where you're supposed to be tracking who has your data and where it's going.
Right. Yeah, I came from that world, and I mean, you are the product. Your data is the product, and that's been going on for a while. And I think it's slowly starting to dawn on people. I mean, there's a great Black Mirror episode about click wrap. You accepted the click wrap license agreement, and you've now given over control of your data to a vendor, and
Yep.
and also the bit you see that in B2C and B2B as well. And I think especially with AI startups, that data that you possess is the value.
Yeah, and I've argued that for a long time that we really need to decide whether we're okay with humans being a product. If we agree that human trafficking should be illegal and that slavery should be illegal and that in general you should not be allowed to buy and sell people, I don't understand why buying and selling their data is vastly different from that. And that's a lot of these companies, and it's one of the things that every time there's a Facebook or Google or one of the large tech companies gets called in front of Congress, it's like
Mhm.
the questions are always around like the specific use cases of the data and the specific ways you violated people's privacy. It's not over this general overarching question of should companies be able to sell humans as a product,
Right.
because your data is just as good as, I mean, it is the digital representation of yourself. And unfortunately, we're enterprises now have a very similar issue, right? Like now enterprises are now entities in and of themselves. And it's the same thing where, if I'm a large private equity fund and I can consolidate, like, say, a payment provider and a security company, I can pretty quickly build a portfolio that can paint a pretty vivid picture of a lot of large enterprises at a pretty scary level. And we, like, legislation tends to lag innovation by
Right.
like 25, 50 years. And we just haven't gotten to a place yet where we're even thinking about things like that. And like,
Yeah.
how much data about an entity should one entity be able to consolidate?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get back to what we're kind of talking about. So how do you think a company should protect themselves to deal with vendor consolidation, disruption from vendor consolidation?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times one of the things that ends up happening is unintentional over reliance on a vendor for things where it's not necessary. And one of the things I think about a lot with that is agents, right? So a lot of times there's this like one for one relationship between agents and the destinations that they're sending data to. And what ends up happening there is if you're using this one agent from a vendor to collect the data, and then something happens with that vendor, it's okay if you're only sending that data to that one vendor, right? Because that's a one for one relationship. But that's not usually what happens, right? Usually what happens is you're collecting that data, it's starting in one place, and then you're distributing it out around your organization. You've got tons of different people using it. And so I think that we need to start really thinking about data from a more holistic end to end source to
Sure.
destination perspective, in that, how am I collecting that data? Who has control over how that data is collected? And then what are the emergency shutoff valves? And so, I love using the commercial plumbing analogy for data, that like if you can't control shutting off your data the same way you can control shutting off water in a commercial building, something's going to go wrong.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that's why it's important that your enterprise architecture function is decoupling. So, for example, if you're storing data, you want to decouple your collection of data from how you store data, and also have a way when you're archived to be in another place as well. Generic formats are very important, since that's another classic way to lock you into. And then be especially careful about SaaS vendors. The data that you put in your SaaS vendor can increasingly be very hard to get it out. And
Yes.
I've personally seen where you put data into a SaaS vendor and they have contracts. Absolutely, you take that data out if you exit as a customer, but they don't give you a way to do it. And so, and you're kind of stuck. And
Yeah.
so those are the kind of things people have to think about and explore. But this is also where I think it's important that the data governance has to mature in more enterprises. You see certain enterprises, especially regulated, will have a chief data officer, they'll have a records function, they'll have teams that keep track of these things. We see plenty of others that don't. And so I think that it's important more broadly. And this is something I would like to see some encouragement, if not regulation, about this function, to have more uniformity, about how data is handled, where it's handled, and just have an understanding, because it should be treated as a risk perspective.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I
You know?
think there's a huge part of that third party risk aspect that it just doesn't, to your point, because
Sure.
a lot of functions are buying SaaS solutions in a vacuum. Typically, it's not going through a process that includes stakeholders from security and IT and operations and procurement, and that oftentimes it's overlooked. Things like, what's the data risk management plan? So like what's the backup plan for collecting this data
Sure.
if this piece of software stops working? Or the I always I call it the oh shit bucket. Like if we can't send data to this platform any longer, what's
Right.
like, and we can't just stop collecting it, what is the backup plan for that?
Right.
And I think it's really important to go through that process. And to your point, I think that a lot of organizations need to mature the way they think about their infrastructure, because they don't think about data as like this holistic kind of thing, right? They think about it in the different pockets and applications it has. But if somebody's not looking at it from an umbrella perspective, a lot of times organizations that have breaches don't even know that the data is out there until somebody else tells them because they weren't
Yeah,
keeping
right.
track of it.
Yeah, there's just no governance, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's a little shocking, or like I mentioned, like SaaS platforms. The proliferation of SaaS platforms is incredible. I was working on a project with my previous employer, and wanted to understand, because put some governance around SaaS. And, oh yeah, I mean 50, 60. Finally found out it was hundreds of SaaS platforms were containing data that no one knew about, because all it takes is a corporate credit card, and bam, you're up and running.
Yeah.
It was just mind blowing.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, I mean, we've had this whole move fast and break things mentality in technology
Sure.
for decades now. And I would never argue that we haven't benefited from rapid innovation and things like that. But we do get to a point where there's not a lot of, and I've been thinking about this increasingly over the last year, thinking about how we audit data, how we track it through an organization, how we, even know, if this piece of data is compromised, these are the people that we know touched it. This is the places we know it could have gone. There really is no audit trail for data, right? Other than in super highly regulated, military and things like that. And thinking about it from the perspective of, we don't really focus on data creation. We just
Right.
kind of let people create data in places, and we don't really focus on, okay, if this data is going to be created, for it to even be created, in a data lake, wherever, there have to be all of these policies around it, all of
Right.
these access controls, all of these audit tools. And it's just not something like we're still blocking and tackling. We have not gotten
Right.
to this strategic kind of data architecture yet.
Yeah, it's definitely, and it's a maturity process. And for some it's like there are requirements for certain companies for this sort of thing, but for most there's not. And I think that's where I'm just not sure anything's going to happen unless there are requirements to, because there is a cost. But it just, I think those are going to be the issues you have to be concerned about. And I especially I would focus on proprietary data vendors, SaaS vendors. I beg and plead anyone if you're using a SaaS vendor that you're putting your corporate data into, you have to have a copy of that data that's in your storage or your control. Because if you put it in the SaaS vendor, it's no longer in your control.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. Yeah, and I
mm,
think that the other thing that people need to consider is that if you're building long-term strategic enterprise plans for data around a key vendor, you need to understand that vendor's long-term strategic plans as well,
right,
and anticipate that those could also change, because I think a lot of times, people sign like 4 or 5 year licenses, and a lot can change in 4 or 5 years. And so you may have a vendor who's like, oh yeah, we if you only go over your license a little bit every now and then, it's not going to be a problem at all. Don't worry about it. And that can really rapidly change. And acquisition of that company by a more fiscally conservative company can really rapidly change that as well, right?
right,
Because after you go out and spend a whole bunch of money to buy a company, you're looking to recoup that money you just spent somewhere. And a lot of times,
exactly.
the way there's everybody who works at any business can tell you 5 pieces of low hanging fruit where you're probably giving revenue away, right? And so I think that's the other thing, is that we tend to take things for granted and take people at their word when it comes to things like that. Like, oh yeah, don't worry about it. If you only go over a couple gigs, we're not going to ding you. We won't shut you off. And that you have to plan with the worst case scenario in mind.
Yeah, you need clarity in your contractual terms. And like, I mean, one of the companies that you mentioned, the acquisition, they had 3 owners in 4 years. And so
Yeah,
that's an example of the just tremendous churn. And especially as private equity takes over a company and starts leaning it out, support goes away. That engineer who knew how that special thing worked goes away because no one cares about that special thing. But the company that is using that special thing is kind of shit out of luck.
yeah. Well, and then one of as the last of the juice is squeezed out of a company, typically the place they really start to try to screw you is taking your data out. Right.
Right.
So they're like, all right, well, if we've maxed out how much we can charge you on all of the data coming in, we know we're storing at least some valuable data for you. So we're going to make it exceptionally difficult to get to that data without paying us to get to it, and exceptionally difficult to get it out. And that's kind of, one of the things that we have started advocating, is really considering keeping copies of all of your critical data in super low cost, high volume storage as a
Right.
backup to whatever high cost, high value storage you have, because things can happen very quickly where you go from being able to access that data to not. And if you have a situation come up where you have some type of compromise or breach, or vulnerability that you're trying to triage, and all of a sudden you need to move petabytes of data, that could become a problem really quickly. So
Right.
I know full redundancy is an ideal that most companies are never going to reach, but you really need to, for the critical data sources that power your security and operations, consider what your redundancy plan is for your key vendors.
Yeah, totally. I mean, your business continuity function should be handling that. But again, that goes back to, do you have one? And most
Yeah.
companies, that's not the case. Because I mean,
Yeah.
that's really where that is. I mean, the new fangled term for it is cyber resiliency, and that's where that should be. And it's something, at least I would encourage companies to think about. You have a ransomware event. How are you going to recover? Can you recover? Where's your data? Do you have backups you can restore? Because that is more often than not, oh, we have a backup. Then you find out we do, but we can't restore it. And so those are questions, and then you have to practice. You have to make it part of your DNA. But those are continuity functions that cost time, that cost money, and companies are like, well, you know what, we never use that, so why are we doing this? And you have to ask yourself about it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that that's the thing that we're starting to see some balance on the other side, because actually come from a finance background, so I spent
Right.
years in investments and insurance and things like
Sure.
that. And one of the difficult things has been that the it's been very difficult to value what a compromise actually costs for the last, up until the last several years, because
Right.
ransomware was this somewhat new thing, and like FTC fines, things like that. But we're getting to the point now that I think the scales are tipping a little bit, and that we've got enough historic data about this is the cost of not doing something. This is the cost of a loss of business function. Because we didn't used to know that, like, hey, if you have a ransomware attack, like I think it was Delta had a ransomware attack that like only impacted them for a couple hours, but the impact was severe. And so we're getting to a point where we now have the data, because I think one of the things our teams struggle with is that uh, security and IT people are not always the most forceful people in the world, right? And so we usually rely on data to back us up and, like, hey, this is a sensible decision because this is the potential cost of not acting. And, the couple $1 billion at this percentage probability equates to this net risk. So that's where I think we're starting to see some, some progress, is that we can actually now quantify some of these risks.
Right. And I think that's also where cyber insurance, things like that, are going to propel people to make those business-based decisions, because if they don't think about it, it's not going to be insurable, and that'll make it even more expensive. Because
Yeah.
that's been an out, I think, for business leaders for quite some time, is that, we're not really losing anything and people forget about it. The cyber insurance will pay off the damages and it'll be okay. And I
Yeah.
think those times are changing. But that's just also where it's just important to at least have these discussions, at least think about it, acknowledge it. If you're going to ignore it, that's fine. More power to you. But at least think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, to your point, that's where regulations are gonna come into play, and the insurers may very well be who finally spurs the regulation that
Yeah.
actually starts to get some of this shit in order. Just like we talked about seatbelt laws in our
Yep.
predictions white paper, because the the crazy way that seatbelt laws ended up becoming a thing, right? This is that it was essentially the federal government set lobbyists from automakers on or on the states to pass seatbelt laws, because essentially the not the FTC, Jesus, the
Federal Highway
Tra-
Safety Board. Yeah.
transportation board, yeah, they
Yeah.
said either I think it was like 75% of the states had to have seatbelt laws, or they were going to require passenger side airbags in all vehicles within a
Right.
couple years, right? And so it's like,
Yeah.
unfortunately, until the highest tier of power structure starts to feel the pain, and in this case, it's going to be banks, right? It's going to be banks left holding the bag um, when these catastrophic insurance losses happen. We don't see meaningful change. But now that we're starting to see cyber risk insurance having to cover $1 million, multi hundreds of millions of dollars in payouts for
Right.
ransomware, we will likely see those insurers start lobbying stricter
Oh,
requirements and
absolutely.
regulation.
Yeah. Insurers aren't in business to pay. And so if you are gonna, if you are going to ignore them, not follow standard practices, frameworks, it's the same thing for construction. There's standard frameworks for construction. We will not insure your building. We will not provide you property insurance. We will not do this unless you follow standard frameworks and standard materials. I think increasingly that's going to bleed over on the IT world. And it's kind of a drag. But I think it's good to have some standards in place, and
Yeah.
and also just broadly, because it's just, it's unfortunate. And I see, especially as we talk, going back to the theme of consolidation, it's going to be the smaller companies and medium-sized companies who are going to get impacted the most by the consolidation and the general chaos of the moment.
Yeah, yeah, the mid-sized companies who are stuck in the middle of being reliant on a vendor. Like
Right.
if you're a pretty small company, you could probably change because the cost of change is not huge. But for the mid-sized companies who are overly reliant on their vendors because they haven't achieved that next level of maturity, it's, they're, to your point, a lot of times held ransom.
Yeah, they really are. So just, I think, to kind of wrap it up for people, I think it's important. Think about it, plan for it. I think there's standard frameworks for handling this. I mean,
Mhm.
let's look at cyber resiliency frameworks. There's some good ones on business continuity where you're thinking through it. Assume, have like I've seen companies that essentially have they'll call it vendor risk, for lack of a better term, where so and so's not doing well. their support's disappearing. We need to be prepared that what's going to happen if they shut down. You always want to think about, as a company, you want to adopt a scrappy startup, but you have to plan on what happens if this 30-person company goes away.
Yep.
And especially think about SaaS providers. So if someone stopped paying the cloud bill, you know what? It's gone. I mean, it's not like it's software you got installed on your laptop that's going to run whether that company's there or not. And so those are just things you have to think about. You have to evaluate. You have to assume. You have to have that formal plan. I think decoupling is very important and in part of your enterprise architecture function, and also making sure that you have a copy of data that you put into SaaS platforms that's under your control. Do you have any other kind of tips, tricks, kind of themes to think about for companies to kind of get themselves prepared for consolidation?
Yeah, I think that, to your point, the level of redundancy you build into your data should be proportionate to the criticality of that data to your business, right? So if
Well,
you have data that is critical to your business, you should be fully redundant in that data. You should be keeping a full copy of that data, either on-prem and on-prem storage, if that's what your business requires, in super low cost object storage in the cloud. It's we've been talking about this for as long as I've been at Cribl, and from a security perspective, this is critical. And that, if you have a SolarWinds issue where you can't send data to a platform anymore and you need to just stand up a whole new vendor and fork a copy of that data off, the redundancy is really important. And again, we're getting to a point where there's data, so make data-based decisions. Make decisions based on, is it likely that this platform will be down for 3 days? No, but what is the potential financial implication of that? And if that happens, and that's, I think a lot of times, from an engineering standpoint, there could be a mentality of, if you can't demonstrate to me that it's likely that it will break, then we're not going to take steps to mitigate the fallout. And especially with data, and with as quickly as we need to be able to move, and as adaptable as we need to be able to be as enterprises to protect ourselves, you can't wait until you demonstrate that harm has been done or is about to be done to create contingency plans. So.
that was really well said. I'm going to make a reel out of that last 35 seconds, because that's something we need to share. Yeah, yeah. It's just all I got to say in a nutshell. Think about the risk, plan for it, acknowledge it, and whether you do something about it, that's a whole other thing. And also, the engineers who say that can't possibly happen, that's when it happens. And so just
It's like
just
in life. That's just an in
yeah,
life thing. The best way to find out you're into something weird is to talk crap about somebody else being into something weird. The best way for something really highly unlikely to happen is for you to be like, that would never happen. The universe loves when people tempt it like that. So that is one thing I have learned as I have gotten old, is the quickest way to ensure that something unlikely will happen is to point out how unlikely it is.
exactly. And I'm always amused by, oh, that'll never happen. Well, guess what? That ransomware just hit. And so what are
Yeah.
we going to do?
Yeah.
Always think about the what's next. And so, and just be aware of what your vendors are doing. Just think critically. I think that's all we can ask.
Yep.
So, Jack, you want to wrap us up and take us home?
Yeah. So if you missed it, we linked our predictions in the chat, and they go through not just the consolidation, but also a handful of other things that we think that you should be mindful of in 2024. So we would love if you would check that out. Send us any feedback. We are gearing up for our spring and summer of travel. So you will be seeing Ed and I at all kinds of different conferences and road shows and everything, everything you can
Tampa, here I
imagine.
come.
So yeah,
Oh, yeah.
um, we are really looking forward to this year. Cribl's got some really big plans. It's the data engine for IT and security. We've got some really awesome new talks that we're working on. So check out our predictions. Let us know if you agree or disagree. And then if you have any ideas for future live streams, we would also love those, because
It's lots
the
of fun.
thoughts are not going to lead themselves.
That is true. It's lots of fun. So for everyone out there, take a look at Cribl community. It's cribl.io/community. Join our Slack community. I think 6,000 to 7,000 strong. Lots of opinions, lots of help. everything everything you're running into, someone else is running into. So we all want to help out. I want to thank everyone for joining today. Have a great Friday. Have a great weekend, and we will be back at it on Monday.
Thanks, everybody.